to this video lecture series for Introduction to Philosophy. In this video, we're going to continue our examination of Plato's Phaedo, and specifically we're going to complete our discussion of Socrates' argument for why the true philosopher should embrace and look forward to death, and specifically for why the true philosopher should see death as the culmination or completion of his philosophical mission. Now, last time I outlined Socrates' reasoning for this claim and what I called the argument from true philosophy. And I want to begin by taking another look at the first part of that argument. So let's go over the premises and the first conclusion of this argument. P1. Death is the separation of the soul from the body. So remember that Plato thinks that we are not just a physical body, we're also an immaterial soul. And what he defines as death is just the moment at which your soul separates from your body. And as he's going to argue later in the dialogue, he thinks that soul is immortal, it lives on forever, but your body is transient, it's contingent, it breaks down, it decays. And so at your death, this process sort of begins, your soul separates from the body, and the body begins to break down. Now, P2, the purpose of the true philosopher is the attainment of knowledge. This is just a common theme we've seen repeatedly in the Socratic dialogues, also emphasized at a number of points in the Phaedo itself. Okay, so death is when the soul separates from the body. The mission of the philosopher, the purpose of the true philosopher is to attain knowledge. And then we get the key claim in premise 3, which we haven't fully explored yet, but will do in this video. One can only attain knowledge if one's soul is separated from one's body. Now put those three claims together. If death is the separation of the body, and we can only attain knowledge when our soul is separated from the body, then the true philosopher can only attain his or her purpose, can only attain knowledge once he or she has died. And in fact, that's exactly what we see in the first conclusion of this argument. Now, the big question here, and the one we have yet to explore, is why in the world does Plato think that we can only attain knowledge after the soul is separated from the body? And we begin to see why Plato thinks this, and it really gets to one of the most fundamental and foundational claims of his entire philosophical system. But we begin to see why he thinks that in the following passage. So Plato writes, "Then what about the actual acquiring of knowledge? Is the body an obstacle when one associates it with it in the search for knowledge? I mean, for example, do men find any truth in sight or hearing? Whenever it attempts to examine anything with the body, isn't the soul clearly deceived?" So I'm going to stop there for a moment. This will seem like a very odd claim, because what Socrates is claiming in this passage is that what it is that leads us astray in acquiring knowledge are our senses. Our sight, our touch, our taste, right? Our hearing, all these things, all of our senses is actually what leads us astray and prevents us from attaining knowledge. But this might seem actually just backwards. We might say, well, wait a minute, how in the world are we supposed to learn anything without our senses? Isn't it the case that not only are the senses necessary for gaining knowledge, but aren't the senses primary in gaining knowledge? Think about, for instance, how you learn to talk, right? You had various objects that you were able to see. Your parents pointed to those objects and said various words you were able to hear. You touched objects and associated them with those words. You smelled different things, right? From a very, very young age, all the information that we gain, all the knowledge we seem to build up, seems to come from our senses. And in fact, for this reason, there's an entire philosophical tradition, a tradition known as empiricism, which holds that sense experience is the foundation of our knowledge. Now, Plato here is explicitly rejecting this. He's saying that no, the senses can be deceptive. The senses are that which lead us astray and don't allow us to attain true knowledge. And for this reason, the philosopher shouldn't really concern him or herself with the senses, or at least concern him or herself with the senses as little as possible. Now, we're going to see some reasons shortly for why Plato holds this view, but we should also notice in this passage he emphasizes what it is that does allow us to gain knowledge. So the senses lead us astray, the senses confuse us, but what does allow us to gain knowledge? Socrates says, "Is it not in reasoning, if anywhere, that any reality becomes clear to the soul?" So it is not through the senses that we primarily attain knowledge. It is primarily through our ability to reason, our higher capacity to think and follow inferences. And he combines this with the claim that, so we gain knowledge to the extent that we allow our reason to function and function well. And what prevents us from using our reason properly? Well, you might guess it. It is the body and the senses which seem to inform the body. So he continues on. The soul reasons best when none of these senses troubles it, neither hearing, nor sight, nor pain, nor pleasure, but when it is most by itself, taking leave of the body and as far as possible, having no contact or association with it in its search for reality. So there are a couple of really important claims here. First, that the senses lead us astray. Second, that the soul can attain truth only through reason, and that we reason best when we leave our body behind. Now, if you take those claims seriously, then we're already moving in the direction of seeing why, for Plato, in fact, death is what allows us to gain knowledge. Because it's only when we die and our soul separates from the body, we finally leave the body behind, and then our reason can work uninhibited. But we should examine this claim in a little more detail, right? So, because Plato is making a fundamental claim about the human person and about the relationship between our body and our soul, or our senses and our reason. So notice some other claims he makes about the body. He says, the body keeps us busy in 1,000 ways because of its need for nurture. And this is, of course, a common, sort of idea, right? I've often had the experience where I said, oh man, I'm tired. I really wish I could stay up and, be more productive or do more things I enjoy or just watch this football game and not worry about having to be extremely tired the next day from lacking sleep. I'm hungry right now. I have to go to the bathroom, right? There's all sorts of ways in which the body keeps us running around. It forces us to cater to it. And so he says the body keeps us busy because of its need for nurture. Moreover, if diseases befall it, they impede our search for the truth. The body fills us with wants, desires, fears, all sorts of illusions and much nonsense. So it's the body's needs for nurture, it's the body's vulnerability to disease, the body's vulnerability to being harmed in all sorts of various ways, its need for protection, that keeps us from exercising our reason and searching after the truth in a philosophical manner. And to see why this is, let's talk a little more about this split between the body and the soul. So the human person is a body and a soul. With the body, Socrates has associated the senses, the desire for pleasure, our aversion to pain, and our emotions, fears, and confusions. And he's associated reason with the soul. Now, one of the main questions you should ask yourself here is, well, given this, why is it that the body inhibits our search for truth? Why is it that the body makes it more difficult for us to seek the truth? Now, he's already sort of hinted at the fact that, well, just the mere fact that the body needs to be nurtured and cared for limits the amount of time that we can spend thinking about serious philosophical questions. And that's part of it. But it goes much deeper than this. There's a real way in which, for Plato, the senses and our desire for pleasure and all our emotions are an active, they actively stop us from seeing what's true. Just take a simple example with the senses. It's a common example pointed to by many philosophers. Right, so imagine that you see an object like a tower off in the distance. Okay, so when that tower appears in your visual field, it might appear as maybe 1 or 2 inches tall. Now, of course, you know that's not true. You know that this could be a skyscraper or a relatively tall building. You know it's actually, in reality, much taller than 1 or 2 inches tall. And then ask yourself, well, what is it that allows you to know that? Well, it's an act of reason in a certain sense, right? So, if you know, for instance, through thinking it through and from past experience, that if you went up to that tower, it would look to you much taller. But again, notice that's not enough, because if you're standing far back, you might say, okay, there's a tower that's 2 inches tall. Now I'm close to it. Now it's a tower that's much, much taller. But all that tells you is that, well, here's 2 different objects, or here's the same object that's changing in size as I change my relation to it. How do we know it's the same object, and that's the same object with a fixed height? Well, we might say it's an act of reason or our higher thinking process, an ability to think objectively. Right? We come up with measurements. Obviously in the case of a tower, a ruler wouldn't be sufficient, but we have things like rulers which allow us to measure objects in an objective way, and we know that the reports our senses give to us can sometimes be faulty or misleading. Now, what I'm about to tell you to do, please don't please don't put yourself in any danger if you decide to do this, but if you gently, and I want to emphasize gently, press your finger against the side of your eyeball, you can make yourself see double, but you don't really think there are two objects. We're all very familiar with optical illusions and all the sorts of ways in which your eyes and appearances can be deceiving. So Plato picks up on this, right? There's all sorts of ways in which the senses can deceive us. It's reason that corrects the senses. Now think about our desire for pleasure or aversion to pain, all of our emotions, and think about it in an argumentative context. How often does your sort of emotional attachment to a given position, whether about morality or politics or religion, how often does an emotional attachment to a given belief you have not enable you to look at the other side and consider their arguments fairly? As I mentioned the very first week of this course in one of the videos I did there, how painful is it to admit that you're wrong, to have an honest pursuit of the truth where you admit the possibility that you could be wrong about something? It's much more common for human beings to engage in what's known as confirmation bias, where we simply look for evidence to support the beliefs we already hold. And it's not hard to think about why that would be, because confirming what you already believe, confirming what your religious or your political community or your family believes, this all feels good. And living in an uncertainty, leaving behind the stable beliefs you grew up with, that can be scary, that can be confusing. Uncertainty has those qualities. And because Plato associates all that with the body, our desire for pleasure, aversion to pain, the emotions and fears and confusions we have, the need the body has for nurture, because Plato associates all that with the body, he sees all that as just an obstacle to knowledge. Now, the body will have some role to play in gaining knowledge, as we'll see, but fundamentally what it is that allows us to gain knowledge is our use of reason. And we reason best when we leave the body behind. So we can see why for Plato, death is going to better enable us to gain knowledge. Okay, so this brings up a further question though. Let's say we accept that the body is an obstacle to knowledge. Fair enough, but we might also wonder, what in the world does Plato mean when he talks about knowing something? What does it mean to know something? And he gives some indication of this in the following passage. What about the following, Simmias? Do we say that there is a such thing as the just itself or not? And the beautiful, and the good? And have you ever seen any of these things with your eyes? In no way. Or have you ever grasped them with your bodily senses? I'm speaking of all things such as bigness, health, strength, and in a word, the reality of all other things, that which each of them essentially is. Now, this is another passage that at first reading is going to seem very odd. So first he has these concepts of justice, beauty, the good, bigness, health, strength, and they're all capitalized. So why is it that they're capitalized? What is he saying here? And also notice the use of the article the. He talks about the just, the beautiful, the good. Just take the example of the beautiful for a second. If you have a phrase like the beautiful, that implies a distinction between the beautiful and beautiful things. So there are things that are beautiful, like various paintings and various statues and musical performances are all beautiful, but then there's the beautiful itself. Notice he talks about the idea of the just itself. So what is Plato saying? He's moving toward this idea that what it means to know something is to know this general abstract concept of it that is different from its particular instances. So to truly know what beauty isn't just to be acquainted with one beautiful painting. It's not just to be acquainted with one beautiful song. It's to be acquainted with what the beautiful is in itself. as he puts it, that which each of them essentially is. And the same with justice, the same with the good, the same with things like bigness, health, and strength. Now, we're going to have to take some time to unpack this claim. But for the moment, we should also pick up on one other thing which Plato says here. Whatever it is he means by the beautiful, the good, these concepts, he says they cannot be grasped with the senses. So whatever it means to know what the beautiful is in and of itself is not something we can ever know through our sense of sight or touch or taste or hearing or smell. And this might also seem weird because you said, well, I went to the Louvre and I saw the Mona Lisa and it was a beautiful painting. I saw it with my eyes. I didn't because, the people who work there would probably take me down, but I could have touched it if I wanted to. So what is he talking about? What is he saying that we can't understand what beauty is in itself or goodness is in itself unless we use the senses? And what does it even mean to talk about a concept in itself? This is a very difficult point to understand, and I think to a large extent it's easiest to understand it if we don't talk about things like justice and beauty and the good, but let's start with something simpler. Let's start with the concept of circularity. So here on your screen I have this picture of a circle that I generated through Microsoft Word. Now, if I asked any of you what that shape is, you would immediately say, well, that's a circle. Okay, now that's a very interesting thing because let's say I had the follow-up question. So I asked, okay, so you say that thing is a circle. Well, what is a circle? What is the definition of a circle? Now, if you have the definition ready to hand, then you would say something like, a circle is a closed geometric figure in which all points are equidistant from the center. That's the technical definition of a circle. Then I would ask you the following. Now apply that definition. Is what you're looking at a circle? Is that a closed geometrical figure in which all points are equidistant from the center, which just means every point in a circle is exactly the same distance from the center? Now, to the naked eye, when I'm looking at it, it looks like a pretty good representation of a circle. But I would be willing to bet if we really had the right tools, or if we really look closely enough, there would be certain ways in which it's a little lopsided, in which some areas of the circle are a little closer to the center than others. The only way I made this was just Microsoft Word. I just using my the capabilities of my hand to move the mouse, I tried to configure the figure to make it look as much like a circle as possible. But I certainly can't claim that I'm able to construct a perfect circle with Microsoft Word. So 2 important things here. You are able to identify that figure is a circle, but you also admit it's not really a circle. Well, that's sort of weird. How is that possible? How is it possible that you could say something is a circle, but know that technically it isn't? And that insight, that sort of experience, is exactly what Plato is picking up on here. Because he's going to use that sort of idea to explain all sorts of concepts, any concept about which we can have knowledge. So then this leads to the most foundational concept of Plato's philosophy. It's the theory of Plato's known as his theory of the forms. So what is the theory of the forms? The theory of the forms holds that to know some concept, X, requires being acquainted with the perfect ideal essence of X, or as Plato terms it, with the form of X. So what does this mean? Well, according to Plato, and there are many details here we'll have to leave out just for the sake of simplicity, but to give you a rough picture, here's what Plato thinks about what it means to know something. So in the empirical world, and what I mean by the empirical world is the world we inhabit in space and time, where we see all sorts of physical objects, including your body. In the empirical world, we'd run into all sorts of things which we might call instances of circularity, right? So you see objects that are circular. Some are, more close to a perfect circle than others, but they're round and you recognize them as circles. But you also know that there is no perfect circle in our experience. In fact, I would submit you very likely, I would say, have never come across an absolutely perfect circle. Even the most perfect circle you've ever come across, very likely, if you look at it closely enough, there will be at some level, it will have some instance of imperfection. Some point of that circle will be slightly closer to the center than others. And that's even to put aside, there's all sorts of things that we immediately say to ourselves, yeah, that's sort of lopsided, but I guess it's like a circle. So in our normal experience in the empirical world within space and time, we have all these objects that we call circles but aren't perfect. And the question Plato is interested in is, how is that possible? How could we possibly recognize something to be a circle when we see it's not perfect? His explanation for that was the following. There must be some form, perfect form of circularity somewhere. Now, as I'm going to explain in a moment, the word somewhere is a little misleading, but there must be something that exists that is actually the perfect form of a circle. And Plato thought that in what we'll call the realm of the forms, which exist outside of space and time. So they don't exist anywhere, they don't exist any when, you might say. They're eternal, they're immaterial, you could say they're divine, and you'll never run into them in the way you run into a table or a tree, for instance. But his point is that in order for us to know that these imperfect things are circles, we must at some point have come into contact with perfection. It's only because we have, at some point in our life, been in contact with a perfect circle that we can even recognize or know that these imperfect things are instantiations of it. And so the way Plato explains it is that the instances of circularity, the imperfect circles, they participate in circularity to some extent. Some more than others. Some circles are more perfect, some are less perfect, but they all participate in that form. And it's not just with as we've seen, it's not just with mathematical concepts that Plato thinks this is the case. It's also with moral concepts, aesthetic concepts, the just, the true, the beautiful, the good. So let's take the concept of justice. And let's think about justice as applied to various societies or various governments. So you might look around the world at various countries that exist on the planet Earth, and you might say, well, I could rank order these in terms of how just they are. But even whatever countries or societies you put at the very top as being the most just, the most fair, the most equal, of course, no society is perfect. Injustice exists everywhere. So just like we never come across a perfect circle, so we also never come across a perfectly just society. Yet, Plato thinks we can talk about justice. We can evaluate these societies, or we can recognize that the most just society still has more work to do, or we can recognize that the least just society is full of corruption. And what is it that allows us to do that? It's precisely because he thinks there must be a perfect form of justice, again, existing outside of space and time, and because at some point we have been acquainted with that perfect form, that's what allows us to see the extent to which other actual societies participate in the form of justice. So the point is, anything that there is to know, there is a perfect form of that thing. So what is the philosophical quest? The philosophical quest is to know what is justice, what is truth, what is beauty, what is goodness. And in order to know those things, that means the philosophical quest is to become fully acquainted with the perfect form of those concepts. Otherwise, our knowledge is only partial. It's only imperfect. It's actually sullied by the senses in the body. Now, there are a few other things that we should say about these forms, right? So there's two characteristics of the forms I want to point to. So first, the forms are ideal. And what that means is what the forms are constituted by are the essential features that define that concept. So think all the way back to the Euthyphro, when Euthyphro said, Socrates asked, what is piety? And Euthyphro says, well, it's what I'm doing right now. And Socrates says, no, I don't want to know an example of piety. I want to know what is the definition, what is essential to piety. Although Socrates wanted to put it this way because the forms are really Plato's main idea, what Socrates was essentially asking for is, what is the form of piety? What are the essential features of piety? So you can think of the forms in terms of their content as just the abstract, perfect definition of any concept, whether it's justice or circularity or beauty or goodness or truth or piety. The second thing is the forms are abstract. They're abstract objects, right? We never encounter these with our senses, and although we come across instantiations, we come across individual items that participate in the forms. For instance, we come across societies that are more or less just, paintings that are more or less beautiful, right? Individuals who are more or less healthy. We never bump into the forms in our everyday empirical life. But that, of course, brings up an interesting question. Do the forms exist? Well, Plato thinks the forms are not just real, that they're the most real. But if they're real, if they exist, where do they exist? Now, to bring this up is to point out that the question where they exist, again, is really a misconception. So, because if they're outside of space and time, there is no place they exist in. And one way to see this is to think of another sort of example that is similar. So consider the sentence, 3 is prime. 3 is a prime number. Now, the first thing to ask yourself about this sentence is, to get an idea of what an abstract object is, ask yourself, the sentence 3 is prime, is that sentence true? Well, sure, that's one of an elementary thing you learn in mathematics. The sentence 3 is prime is a true sentence. Okay, now ask yourself another question. If 3 is prime is true, what makes it true? Right, and to get a handle on this, let's say I say the sentence, grass is green. Okay, that's a true sentence. Well, what makes it true? Well, what makes it true is that there's an object called grass in the world, and that grass has the property of being green. I can point out in the world and show you that grass is green, and that's what makes the sentence true. So the sentence 3 is prime is true, then shouldn't it also be the case that there's something I can point to which makes it true? And for Plato, what we're pointing to in this case is the abstract object of 3. This abstract object of the number 3. That's what makes the sentence true, is that being prime is a property of the number 3. So now, but then the question is, well, where is that object? Where does it exist? Now, if you have something like Plato's forms, then you say, well, I would point you to the form of the number 3. And I can't literally point it out to you because it doesn't exist in space and time. But there is a realm in which it exists. It is a real thing. And that existence is what makes the sentence true. But now imagine that Plato's theory of the forms isn't true. There is no realm where there is a perfect essence of every concept. There is no realm where there's the form of the number 3. There are no abstract objects. And then I ask you, okay, so you're saying 3 is prime is true. What makes it true? Well, there's nothing you can point to. Because we don't come across the number 3 itself in our normal experience. We come across 3 apples, and we come across 3 cars and 3 trees. But we never come across the number 3 itself. So this is a lot of the motivation for why Plato and many philosophers today accept something like Plato's theory of the forms. Because it seems sometimes we need abstract objects that we don't run into with our senses in order to explain how certain sentences can be true. And so as one philosopher explains, this is how the Platonic view works in terms of concepts like the number 3. According to Platonism, 3 is different from the moon in that it is not a physical object, it is wholly non-physical, non-mental, and causally inert, and it does not exist in space or time. One might put this metaphorically by saying that on the Platonist view, numbers exist in Platonic heaven. But we should not infer from this that according to Platonism, numbers exist in a place. They do not, for the concept of a place is a physical spatial concept, and numbers, on the Platonic view, do not exist in space and time. So the point is, if we're going to make sense of concepts like the number 3, of concepts like circularity, of concepts like perfect justice, of concepts like perfect goodness and perfect beauty, then we must posit some realm that is not physical, some realm that exists outside of space and time. And for Plato, that is the realm of the forms. Okay, now this is all quite abstract philosophical reasoning, but let's bring it back to the main point. So remember the premise we're trying to explain. One can attain knowledge only if one's soul is separated from the body. Now that what we know about Plato's theory of the forms, we can give a better explanation of this. Because if we never run across the perfect concept of something in our experience, then we can never have knowledge of that from experience. If we never encounter perfect beauty in our experience, then we can never understand what perfect beauty is with our senses alone. In fact, we can't use our body at all to get to perfection. What we need to do, in fact, is to be in a situation where we can be acquainted with or encounter the non-material forms that exist outside of space and time. And if death is the separation of the soul from the body, then death seems like the perfect opportunity to do that. Because when the soul separates from the body, what will be left is just our capacity to reason. We won't have all the fear and confusion and need for nurture of the body. We'll only be left with what is divine or immaterial about us. And through that element, we will then be able to become acquainted with and understand the forms. And one of the ways that Socrates puts this, right, he talks again about all the ways in which the body prevents us from attaining knowledge, but I want to highlight another passage he has here. He says, in this way we shall escape the contamination of the body's folly. We shall be likely to be in the company of people of the same kind, and by our own efforts we shall know all that is pure, which is presumably the truth. For it is not permitted for the impure to attain the pure. So there's this concept of purity here. The forms which constitute true knowledge are what are pure. The body is impure. It is dragged down and weighed down by all sorts of sensual concerns about pleasure and pain and desire and confusion and emotion. And he says, as long as we are trapped in our bodies, we'll never be able to attain the pure truth. But once we die, we'll finally be purified. We'll leave our bodies behind. Only that divine element, our soul, will remain. And because he thinks the impure cannot attain the pure, but only what is pure in itself can understand the forms and understand pure knowledge, it is only after our death that we'll finally understand perfection. We'll know what perfect piety is. We'll know what perfect justice is. We'll know what perfect circularity is. And most importantly of all for Plato, we will finally understand perfect goodness. That is precisely why the true philosopher has no reason to fear death, but in fact should embrace death and should face death with good cheer, because death allows the opportunity for the philosopher to become acquainted with the forms. Now, of course, all that depends on the idea that the soul is immortal, that the soul outlasts our body, that the soul doesn't die when the body dies. And Socrates still hasn't given us arguments for why he thinks that's the case. And in our next series of videos, that is exactly what we're going to look at. We're going to look at the arguments he gives for why the soul is immortal. So I will leave that material till then. But for the moment, I'll cut here. I hope you found this video useful, and I will see you next time.